What happens when an empress loses her throne? Most fade into silence. But Joséphine de Beauharnais did something else. She staged a comeback without ever returning to court. Her battlefield was not politics, not war, not the palace. It was a villa outside Paris, Malmaison. Here she invented a strategy that transformed loss into legacy, turning exile into influence, and domestic walls into a diplomatic theatre. The late 18th century tore crowns from heads. The French Revolution had guillotined a queen. The empire that followed demanded strength, order, glory. Into this chaos came a woman from Martinique, Joséphine, born Marie Josephe Rose Tascher de la Pagerie. She survived a revolution that claimed her first husband. She endured poverty, gossip, and prison. By the time she met Napoleon Bonaparte, she had already lived 3 lives: widow, survivor, socialite. Napoleon gave her a 4th empress. Yet her real genius was never in the throne room. It was in atmosphere. Joséphine understood the hidden law of power. Culture is the stage upon which politics performs. At Napoleon's side, she embodied the empire's elegance. While he conquered with cannons, she conquered with salons. But she prepared a seed no one noticed. A house west of Paris, purchased in 1799, the Château de Malmaison. It was not Versailles, not the Tuileries. It was modest, but it was hers. While Napoleon obsessed over battles and borders, Joséphine filled Malmaison with artists, botanists, musicians, diplomats. It was an ark disguised as a villa, a rehearsal for the day she might need her own stage. In 1810 the blow fell. Napoleon demanded a divorce. He needed an heir, and she could not give him one. Joséphine signed away her marriage, her crown, her title. History often writes this moment as tragedy. But watch carefully. She did not return to obscurity. She returned to Malmaison. And Malmaison bloomed. Here begins the Malmaison strategy. What did it mean? 3 moves. First, collect. Joséphine turned Malmaison into a museum before France even knew what a museum could be. She bought Dutch paintings, classical statues, exotic plants, rare books. She imported roses from every corner of the globe, over 200 varieties. Her gardens became as famous as her drawing rooms. Second, curate. She understood that objects alone meant nothing. What mattered was placement. A statue illuminated at dusk, a rose blooming near a window where diplomats drank wine, a painting hung at the exact height to catch candlelight. She orchestrated conversations by orchestrating surroundings. Third host. At Malmaison, every evening was diplomacy disguised as leisure. Ministers, artists, scientists, foreign envoys, they came not for orders but for invitations, and invitations became a new form of power. In a fractured France, Joséphine built unity through beauty. This was no retreat. This was strategy. By the time Napoleon remarried and his empire reached its height, Malmaison had already stolen attention. In Paris, politics shouted. At Malmaison, culture whispered, and whispers outlast noise. Visitors left speaking of Joséphine's taste, her roses, her effortless authority. She had no throne yet. Every guest felt they had entered a capital. When war finally consumed Napoleon, when his empire cracked, Malmaison remained standing. It was Joséphine's quiet triumph to lose the empire but keep the legacy. History too often calls her Napoleon's ornament, a beautiful decoration beside ambition, but Malmaison proves otherwise. No ornament collects an empire's art. No ornament builds the most famous rose garden in Europe. No ornament turns a private villa into a cultural embassy. Joséphine was not decoration. She was design, not an accessory, but a strategist. When Joséphine died in 1814, Malmaison was already legend. Her collections scattered her roses, replanted her influence, absorbed by the city she loved. But her method outlived her. Malmaison showed that exile need not mean absence. It can mean invention. 3 lessons remain. First, curate your environment. Power is not only in people, it is in places. Second, build a new stage when the old one collapses. Thrones may vanish, but audiences remain. Third, use culture as strategy. Armies fade. Styles endure. Joséphine de Beauharnais, once Empress, later exile, remains above all an architect of atmosphere. Her Malmaison strategy whispers across centuries, lose the crown if you must, but never lose the stage. Because the stage is where history listens. What does it mean to choose exile? For a queen, it means stepping off the map, only to redraw it with ink made of music, marble, and flame. In 1654, Christina of Sweden lifted a crown from her own head and set it down like a stage prop. She would leave the northern snow, cross the Alps, and arrive in Rome, not as a refugee, but as an impresario. She did not carry regiments. She carried a repertoire. She had been trained like a prince: languages, philosophy, statecraft, hunting, fencing. Her tutors poured a library into a young mind that loved the noise of ideas more than the silence of protocol. She inherited a kingdom in the wake of the 30 Years' War, an age when Europe bled and learned to love ceremony because it soothed the wound. From childhood, Christina understood the secret of power in a theatrical century. A mind needs a stage. So when she decided to abdicate, stunning her court, shocking her Protestant allies, electrifying the rumor mills from Hamburg to Madrid, she was not stepping into absence. She was stepping into a larger audience. She passed the crown to her cousin. She prepared a new script. The journey south was a procession of whispers. Why would a queen give away a throne? Why Rome? Because the city had a talent for turning contradictions into monuments. With every mile, Christina stripped away one identity and tried on another philosopher queen, Catholic convert, patron, collector, the sovereign of a court without borders. She crossed into Italy under winter skies and found in stone what she wanted for herself: permanence. Rome knows how to greet a drama. When Christina entered the city, advent calendars of bells were rung, torches lifted, balconies draped. The streets became a ceremonial corridor. Artists staged allegories in which the northern star met the Mediterranean sun. If the old Christina had walked through these gates as a treaty, the new Christina walked through them as a premiere. A queen without a country, yes, but at last a queen with a capital. She settled into the Palazzo Riario, a building with rooms large enough to float music. There, her household was remixed into a cultural engine. The great hall became a theatre. Musicians were paid not as servants but as protagonists. Composers found deadlines. Dancers found stairs that wanted to be descended. Philosophers were given corners to argue in. Antiquarians were given lamps. Christina's evenings became the kind of appointment that diplomats pretended to loathe and never missed. A letter of audience could take months. A ticket to one of her nights took a nod. Nothing about her collecting was quiet. She acquired paintings and bronzes and ancient cameos, not to hang the way one hangs a memory, but to cast parts in a play. A Roman torso might be placed so that a visitor turned his head at the perfect moment in a conversation about courage. A portrait might be hung opposite a window so that light rehearsed with it at 5 in the afternoon. She valued provenance, yes, but above that she valued effect, the way an object could redirect the conversation as surely as a shift of key in the orchestra pit. If patronage in the Renaissance meant underwriting a work, patronage in Christina's Rome meant orchestrating circumstances. She learned tempo. She understood how long a guest could be kept waiting before the anticipation turned addictive, how many candles transformed austerity into splendor, where to seat a hostile envoy so he would be caught in the undertow of applause at the finale. People called her Regina senza regno, the queen without a kingdom. She smiled. She had a currency they could spend nowhere else attention. Her life, however, kept a shadow in the wings. Exile is not freedom without friction. It is freedom with friction. The scandal in France, an execution ordered within the walls of Fontainebleau, followed her like the smell of smoke in a theatre long after the audience had left. The story changed shape, as all stories do, swelling when enemies needed it, shrinking when friends spoke her name. What matters for our stage tonight is this: Christina understood that reputations do not die under attack, they die in silence. She answered with spectacle. If something darkened her name in one capital, she lighted it in another, and Rome helped. The city welcomed her with pageants that translated biography into allegory. The queen is the star, the city is the sky. Poets minted verses, sculptors shaped marble vortices of hair and cloth that seemed to move when the candelabra trembled. She became the subject of portraits and orations, but also the author of Rooms, a place where a corridor opened onto a surprise performance, a landing where singers waited like ambushes, a window framed so that the Tiber looked like a ribbon laid across the room by an invisible hand. Christina's court prized conversation as much as composition. She wanted minds that met like flint. Musicians played not only to impress the queen, but to contradict one another in front of her. A violin part might argue with a trumpet, the way two philosophers argue with syllogisms. She brought together men and women who normally belonged to rival circles and made rivalry a genre. If the Papal States were ruled by liturgy, Christina's apartment was ruled by curiosity. Her collecting followed the same logic. Works of the ancient world sat beside early modern virtuosity, not to be compared, but to be activated. A Greek coin might be placed in a tray at supper as a conversation starter about sovereignty. A fragment of a marble hand might rest on a table like an invitation to touch what time cannot destroy. She assembled a library to mirror the city's confluence of tongues. Books were not arranged by author, but by occasion: what to read before a masque, what to quote in the presence of a learned Jesuit, what to lend to a poet, because lending is a way of commissioning. Composers felt the pull of her gravity. Some dedicated works to her not because flattery was cheap, but because flattery is sometimes a form of relief. One sings the name that fills the hall. Instrumental music in Rome ripened under her roof, sleek with virtuosity, heated by competition. There were winter nights when the bow hairs of the violins seemed to smoke. A guest might leave convinced that he had heard not a program but a policy. Rome again is the capital of Europe, not through armies but through art. What did Christina believe? She believed that power is as much arrangement as it is authority. She believed architecture could be tuned like an instrument, and that a corridor can have an argument with a staircase. She believed scandal could be absorbed by narrative, the way dissonance resolves into a chord. She believed, perhaps most of all, that the throne and the theatre are not opposites. They are neighbours. It is worth pausing over the word exile. We imagine banishment as emptiness, a subtraction. Christina proved it could be an addition. Exile in her hands was the freedom to change scale. She left a room in Stockholm and gained an audience on the continent. She lost the right to command and gained the power to convene. In statecraft, this is rarer than victory. It is style. Her nights in the palazzo became a school for diplomats who had forgotten how to feel. You cannot negotiate with a man whose senses are asleep, so awaken them. Show him marble like bread. Sound a trumpet where he expected a rebuke. Give him at midnight a comedy that makes his shoulders shake and therefore softens his morning memorandum. There is a kind of persuasion only beauty attempts, and Christina was shameless in attempting it. In time, her collection would be dispersed, as collections are. Objects go on living in the houses of others because beautiful things are citizens of many countries. Some pictures crossed borders. Some manuscripts were folded into the holdings of institutions that guard them now. A few sculptures took new addresses, but the method stayed behind a residue on the city's habits, the knowledge that a room can conduct politics, the memory of nights when Rome assembled, not to obey nor to rebel, but to listen. You may ask whether this was vanity. She was not humble, but humility is not the metric here. The metric is effect. Did Christina's Rome alter the way elites imagined their work? Yes. Did it provide patronage that allowed music to evolve to quicken its pulse and lengthen its breath? Yes. Did it demonstrate that a woman without rank could still throw a shadow on the map? Yes. There is a scene I love to imagine. The palazzo is warm with candlelight. The guests have eaten and risen and migrated with their wine to the grand hall. The Queen has taken a seat that is not a throne but looks suspiciously like one. A young composer, not yet famous, waits behind a screen. On a table near the Queen's elbow lies an ancient cameo of a goddess, a face lifted from stone, softer in shadow. The musicians begin. A theme opens like a window. A figure, perhaps an allegorical entrant, perhaps a living dancer, crosses the floor toward the Queen, and for 5 minutes everyone forgets their languages. When the final cadence lands, it lands on Christina's smile, and that smile is a decision this man will be heard again. And because she has decided, Rome will decide, and then Europe. Power, at its best, is a circulation of permission. She gave permission to talent to meet opportunity. She gave permission to rooms to be rooms again instead of offices. She gave permission to herself to be large in public, without apologizing for having once worn a crown. We live now in a century that pretends the stage is everywhere, because screens are everywhere. But stages are not surfaces, they are contexts. Christina would have detested our laziness about context. She would have made us come to the palazzo sweat under the candles, listen past midnight, and talk with the enemy until he laughed. She would have cured us of the superstition that attention is cheap because it is measurable. She knew that attention is rare because it is human. What can we take from her? 3 things at least. First, stage the mind. If you have ideas, build them a room. Do not expect the world to host them politely. Host them yourself. Second, curate networks. A collection of objects means nothing without a collection of relationships. Third, exile to center. When you are pushed out, step sideways into a new circle and compel gravity to follow. Christina of Sweden did not withdraw from history. What if a painting were not simply decoration, but a lever of power? What if a room of paintings could steer politics, reshape alliances, and even decide the fate of a city? In the year 1500, at the height of the Italian wars, a woman sat down to write to Leonardo da Vinci. She did not ask for an autograph. She did not beg for a token of his genius. She wrote to commission leverage. Her name was Isabella d'Este, and her private chamber in Mantua, the celebrated studiolo, glowed with the warmth of gilded wood and oil paint. But it was not a retreat for leisure. It was a control room, a carefully designed theatre, where objects and images were deployed as instruments of persuasion. To understand Isabella, one must first understand the map she faced. Mantua was small, surrounded by giants. To the east, Venice ruled the seas and commanded trade. To the north, Milan bristled with soldiers and fortresses. To the south, Florence lived by banking and diplomacy, guided by the cunning Medici. And above them all loomed the Papal States, where popes commanded both armies and an empire of faith. Mantua, by comparison, was fragile, a speck on the chessboard of powers. Yet into this precarious landscape stepped Isabella d'Este, born a princess of Ferrara, and married into the Gonzaga family of Mantua. She understood immediately that Mantua's survival would not depend on walls or weapons alone. Its defense would be cultural, its shield would be symbolic capital, its fortress would be the power of taste. So Isabella built a language out of images. She turned culture into policy. The studiolo was the heart of this strategy. It was not large, but it was dense with meaning. Visitors entering it might first notice the dark walnut panels inlaid with intarsia, creating illusions of cupboards and books. The air smelled of beeswax and parchment. Light filtered through small windows and flickering candles, forcing guests to lower their voices, to lean forward to listen. Isabella designed it that way. The studiolo was not ornament. It was choreography. Every object, every picture, every antique cameo in the room was a word in a carefully edited sentence, and together these sentences formed arguments about Mantua, its dignity, its alliances, its rightful place among the great states of Italy. To execute this program, Isabella needed more than craftsmen. She needed philosophers with brushes, painters who could turn allegory into policy. She found such a partner in Andrea Mantegna Mantua's court painter. Her instructions to him were as blunt as they were visionary paint mythology as strategy. The first canvas was Parnassus. At first glance it seemed a celebration of Apollo and the Muses cavorting on a rocky hill, but the hill itself was Mantua. The message was unmistakable: Mantua is the summit of inspiration. To ally with Mantua is to ascend into the company of the Muses. The second canvas was The Triumph of the Virtues. In it, Minerva, goddess of wisdom, drives out the vices. Reason defeats appetite. Calculation overcomes impulse. This was not a decorative fable. It was a constitution painted in oil. It declared that here in Mantua virtue rules, intellect governs policy, and disorder is banished. To walk into the studiolo and look upon these works was not to be entertained. It was to be instructed. These were not pictures. They were commands. But art, no matter how beautiful, does not float above history. War was tearing Italy apart. Alliances fractured cities, changed sides overnight, and Isabella's husband, Francesco Gonzaga, was captured in battle. Mantua itself seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet Isabella did not panic. She negotiated. She wrote letters to princes and envoys. She hosted emissaries, weighing every gift and every phrase. And while other nobles sold off their treasures to pay ransoms, Isabella acquired. She bought Roman cameos, coins, and bronzes, placing them in her studiolo, like evidence in a courtroom. A Julius Caesar cameo on the table said, more than a speech, Mantua negotiates not only with generals but with history itself. To converse with Isabella was to sit across from Caesar, Minerva, Apollo, and the entire authority of antiquity. In this way she kept her city intact and kept the studiolo lit even in the darkest hours. Her genius was not improvisation but method, a repeatable system of power. She had 5 steps. First, commission with a thesis. Every image must serve a policy goal. A painting was not decoration, it was a directive. Second, buy in cycles. One work may be dismissed as curiosity, but a sequence reads like a sentence. Isabella built narratives through series of works. Third, set a hard, brief respect, genius, but lead the agenda. Her letters to Leonardo specified the pose, the instrument, even the tone she desired. Fourth, use antiquities as notarized evidence. A cameo, a coin, a bust carried the authority of centuries. It was as though history itself had signed her argument. And fifth, never mistake taste for vanity. Taste was not frivolous. Taste was infrastructure as essential to governance as walls or treaties. Her exchange with Leonardo da Vinci reveals this method in action. Isabella wanted a finished portrait, a polished oil painting ready to display. Leonardo, elusive and enigmatic, gave her something else, a cartoon, a drawing of breathtaking beauty. At first glance, a disappointment. But Isabella understood the deeper power. The drawing, widely copied, created something larger than a single canvas. It created the idea of Isabella. The idea of a woman who could command Leonardo's attention, who could negotiate with genius on equal terms. This was not a failure, but a weapon of a different kind. Influence unbound, from canvas reputation multiplied across Europe. Yet myths about her persist. Some say she collected only to flaunt wealth. False. Her collections were not trophies but arguments. Others claim she stood behind men powerless. Wrong. When her husband was imprisoned, she ruled. She ransomed, she commanded troops, she realigned alliances, she steered Mantua through chaos. For her art was both mask and strike. It concealed ambition while delivering blows. Isabella died in 1539, but her studiolo remained a time capsule whispering lessons across centuries. The first lesson: occupy the gap. When institutions fail, build a space of your own, a studiolo, a workshop, a chamber where your authority is unquestioned. The second lesson: support the living. Commission in the year of making. Invest in the creators of your time, for they give voice to your age. The third lesson: curate as sentences. Do not collect at random. Arrange and edit until your narrative is unmistakable, until your will is legible. Stand under Minerva's gaze, and you will hear the same verdict heard 500 years ago. Taste is not frivolous. Taste is power edited. Why does Isabella matter today? Because we still live in a world where images steer politics. A photograph can swing an election. A meme can move markets. A backdrop at a press conference can send a message as deliberate as a Mantegna allegory. Isabella reminds us that this is not new. She mastered the grammar of images before mass media existed. She teaches us that to survive between giants, you must speak a language larger than your size. Her studiolo was small. Her influence was vast. So tonight, as you look at the walls of your own room, ask yourself what hangs there. Are they random decorations, or are they sentences in the story you want to tell? You do not need a palace to build a studiolo. You need intent. You need a thesis. You need the courage to turn beauty into infrastructure. Isabella d'Este did it 500 years ago. She defended a city with paintings negotiated with emperors, using cameos, and outlasted war with a chamber full of arguments. She leaves us with this quiet command: edit your world, compose your narrative, build your studiolo. For 34 years on the throne, Catherine the Great expanded Russia's empire to the Black Sea and transformed it into a true European power. Yet what secured her legend was not only armies and treaties, it was art. Her most enduring legacy is the Hermitage, a museum born from passion, intellect, and strategy, crafted by an empress who understood that culture could be as powerful as war. This is not just the story of a monarch. It is the journey of a foreign bride who became Empress of Russia, an outsider who faced suspicion, intrigue, and betrayal, but who turned art into politics and a museum into a declaration of civilization. The year is 1729. In the small Prussian town of Stettin, a girl named Sophia Frederica Auguste is born. No one imagines this princess from a minor German principality will one day rule the largest empire on earth. Her childhood is modest, yet marked by sharp intelligence and an insatiable hunger for books. She devours philosophy, languages, and history. Even before fate intervenes, she is preparing herself for something greater. That fate arrives when Sophia is chosen to marry Peter, heir to the Russian throne. She is just 14 when she travels to a land so vast, so foreign, that it feels like another world. She learns Russian with relentless discipline, converts to the Orthodox faith, and takes a new name, Catherine. But her new life is anything but secure. At court, she is treated with suspicion as a foreigner. Her marriage to Peter is fraught with unhappiness and humiliation. Yet Catherine does not surrender. In the quiet of her chambers, she immerses herself in Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot. From their words, she draws conviction an empire cannot survive on bayonets alone. It must be enlightened, educated, and cultured. These nights of study will become the foundation of her reign. Then comes the turning point. In 1762, Peter III becomes Tsar. His rule is weak, erratic, disconnected from the needs of his people. Within 6 months, Catherine moves decisively. She orchestrates a nearly bloodless coup. Peter is deposed. Catherine ascends the throne. Europe is stunned. A German-born woman has seized the crown of Russia. From that day forward, she must prove she is not a usurper, but the rightful architect of Russia's destiny. While most rulers cement power through wars, Catherine sees another path. She understands that true greatness requires culture. She begins corresponding with Europe's greatest minds. Voltaire hails her as a philosopher on the throne. Diderot dreams of her as a sovereign who might realize the Enlightenment's ideals. These relationships strengthen her legitimacy abroad, but they also shape her vision of Russia's future. The seed of that vision takes root in 1764. Catherine acquires 225 paintings from a Berlin merchant. She houses them in a small chamber of the Winter Palace and calls it the Hermitage, a retreat, a place of solitude. At first it is modest, but in that modesty lies the origin of one of the world's greatest museums. From that chamber the Hermitage grows relentlessly. Catherine purchases entire collections from across Europe. Dutch masters Rembrandt, Rubens, Van Dyck. Italian treasures Raphael, Titian, Giorgione, ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, tens of thousands of books. Each acquisition is not indulgence but strategy. Each work is a building block in the architecture of an enlightened empire. Within 2 decades, her collection grows to more than 4,000 paintings, 38,000 books, and thousands of sculptures and jewels. The Hermitage is no longer a retreat. It is a palace of art, dazzling envoys and nobles alike. Those who enter its halls leave not only impressed, but transformed. The message is undeniable. Russia is no longer a distant, barbaric frontier. Russia stands among the enlightened powers of Europe. Critics, then and now, have said Catherine's collecting was vanity, an extravagance of a vain monarch. But the truth is far sharper. Catherine wielded art as a weapon. If armies expanded borders, art expanded respect. Where swords demanded obedience, paintings commanded admiration. The Hermitage was her soft power, a force that compelled Europe to acknowledge Russia's place at the table of civilization. Her collecting was also personal. In these works she found solace and affirmation. She once wrote that she needed to create a paradise within 4 walls. The Hermitage was that paradise, a space where she could retreat, reflect, and remind herself of her vision. Yet she was always aware that this private paradise was also a public declaration. The ambassadors who walked its halls saw more than paintings. They saw legitimacy, intellect, and power. By the time Catherine died in 1796, she had left behind not only a stronger empire, but a cultural beacon. The Hermitage had already become one of Europe's greatest collections. Today it houses over 3 million works. From Leonardo da Vinci to Matisse, from Raphael to Picasso. But at its core remains the vision of a single woman who dared to believe art could be as powerful as war. From Catherine's life, 3 lessons remain. First, soft power outlasts hard power. Battles may redraw maps, but culture redraws memory. Second, culture is never just beauty. It is strategy, it is legitimacy, it is persuasion. And third, one woman can rewrite history not only with armies and crowns, but with books, ideas, and canvases. So when you walk through the Hermitage today, amid its gilded halls and endless galleries, remember that it began with a single woman's conviction. A foreign bride who arrived in Russia unwanted, who seized a throne against all odds, and who built an empire not only of land but of culture. If you believe true power lies not just in borders and battles but in art and memory, then Catherine the Great's story still speaks to you. Her legacy shines not only in the grandeur of street, Petersburg, but in the enduring truth that beauty can rule as firmly as steel. New York, January 5, 1943. A sign on West 57th Street reads, "Exhibition by 31 women. It is not a slogan, it is a line in the sand." Inside, 31 voices step into the light at once. The woman who opens that door is Peggy Guggenheim. Here is what you will see: how a gap becomes a stage, how design turns into persuasion, and how a single program can move the center of gravity. Wind back 1 year, art of this century opens in 1942, not a white cube a stage. Frederick Kiesler suspends works so they seem to float. Light pulls the eye. The route through the room is choreographed. The space makes an argument before a single word is spoken. Now the decision. Peggy looks at the exhibition lists and sees an absence so obvious it feels invisible. Women are there in studios and letters, but not on the wall. So she writes a sentence the city has not read before: exhibition by 31 women. She asks Marcel Duchamp to advise the format and selections. Then she commits the room. The title does not hedge. It does not ask permission. It simply names who is speaking and then lets the work speak. Open the doors and watch the mixture. Abstraction beside surrealism. Europe beside America. Names you know beside names you should have known sooner: Frida Kahlo and Leonora Carrington. Leonore Feeney and Merritt Oppenheim. Dorothea Tanning and Louise Nevelson. Hedda Stern. Kay Sage. Vieira da Silva. The point is not a single style. The point is range. Look at how the room teaches you to look. Pieces are paired to create friction. Scale shifts from intimate to emphatic. A corner becomes a hinge between ideas. What you meet is not a parade of frames, but a conversation you have to walk through. Design is doing the quiet work of persuasion. The city reacts. Some critics squint for labels. Is this a stunt? Is it a manifesto? Peggy declines the trap. She centers the work and lets the audience do the naming. Attendance rises. The list of artists circulates. A curtain that had been half drawn for decades moves a little more open. And it does not end at one night. 2 years later, she returns with The Women, 1945, extending the argument. Meanwhile, the same gallery launches Jackson Pollock into his first solo show and commissions Mural. This is the method: build a runway, not a headline. Make it a program, not an exception. Why does this matter now? Because habits outlive evidence. Institutions repeat what they have already seen. Peggy's move breaks a loop without breaking the audience. She uses the tools of a patron money-space schedule and aims them at a gap everyone pretends not to see. She does not wait for the market to invent demand. She manufactures the conditions in which demand can hear itself. Think of what the title does to your expectations. Exhibition by 31 women. You enter prepared for a single note. You leave with a chord. The show refuses the idea of the woman artist as a genre. It replaces the cliché with a map. What lingers after the posters come down is a procedure anyone can use. Find the empty lane. Design the encounter, not just the wall. Repeat until a novelty becomes a habit. 3 takeaways clean. 1, occupy the gap. If the lane does not exist, stripe it and drive. 2, design is persuasion. Sightlines height pacing the room, writes the subtext. 3, make it a program. One night argues. A sequence convinces. If you were standing on West 57th in January 1943, would you hang that sign? Would you take the risk of clarity, A or B, occupy the gap, or wait for consensus? And if you ran your own version today, which 3 names would you put on the wall first? Venice, 1948. One nation doesn't show up. The Greek pavilion stands empty. A private collector is invited to fill it. She hangs 136 works in 3 days, and modern art walks back into Europe like it owns the stage. This isn't a museum press release. This is Peggy Guggenheim. What you'll take away, how she turned a vacancy into a victory, how design became persuasion, and why place, not just taste, can change the read of art. Before the doors open, rewind a few years, Paris 39 to 40. Peggy sets herself a rule: buy a picture a day. Cubists, surrealists, the unfashionable, the urgent. It isn't just collecting. It's salvage and a plan. The plan says, when the room is ready, be first through the door. The room is Venice. After the war, the Biennale returns. Pavilions expect safe choices. Then Rodolfo Pallochini makes a call: use the empty Greek pavilion, show the present tense. Peggy says yes. She brings the new with no apology: Brancusi and Kandinsky beside Miro and Klee. Early abstraction and surrealism. And a young American language Europe has barely heard pronounce itself. It's not nationalism. It's proof of life. For the build, she partners with Carlo Scarpa. Not a decorator, an architect of how you encounter a picture. Scarpa sketches routes, sightlines, heights. A Mondrian anchors a wall. Other works climb around it. Some pieces hang in corners, heresy then common sense now. Frames float. The gallery breathes. You don't walk past a row of rectangles. You climb a conversation, and the city watches. Critics file dispatches. Crowds queue. Someone calls it like popping a bottle of champagne after years of calling this art-degenerate Europe, suddenly sees it alive again. The scandal isn't the bodies or the colours. The scandal is clarity. Does a private eye belong in a national pavilion in 48? That's the question. Peggy's answer is blunt. If the nation won't introduce the future, I will. She is not there to flatter flags. She is there to switch on a century. Now the trick no one notices at first place. The Greek pavilion gives height and distance. Windows thresholds a cadence of rooms. Scarpa uses it all. The same painting shifts character when the architecture shifts the approach. Design doesn't just decorate. It argues. Zoom in on a corner. A Brancusi sits with a Miro. You step left, lines align. You step right, a color leaps. Scarpa is conducting. Peggy is programming. The audience is learning to look again. And outside the Giardini, Peggy is already thinking about a permanent home. In 1949, she buys the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni on the Grand Canal. 2 years later, she opens her doors free, 3 afternoons a week. A private address becomes a public habit. Venice doesn't just host art. Venice frames it. Myths pop up as they do. Anyone with money could have done that, except they didn't. Because money acquires. A patron orchestrates. A buyer fills walls. A patron builds context. Peggy's genius isn't just what she owns. It's where and how she makes you meet it. Another myth. It was all shock value. But shock ends at the door. What remains is sequence. The order you meet works in the scale. They command the dialogue that makes a Pollock red next to a Klee, or a Mondrian steady a room, while a Miro sets it spinning. This is curation as grammar. What changed after 48? Europe stopped treating the new like a rumour. Young artists saw a map and a standard. The Biennale remembered its job not to mirror consensus, but to introduce what consensus will later pretend it always loved. 3 takeaways clean. 1. Occupy the empty pavilion. Vacancies are invitations. If the stage is open, step on it. 2. Design is persuasion. Sightlines, height-pacing architecture writes the subtext. 3. Place is soft power. Choose the room and you choose the reading. If you had the keys to an empty national pavilion, would you install a private collection and call it the present? A. Take the room. B. Wait for permission. Tell me A or B and which 3 works you'd hang first. What do you do when the biggest museum in your city says no New York 1929? Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney offers more than 500 works of modern American art as a gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The offer is declined. A door closes and a mandate opens. Here is what we'll trace tonight: why American artists needed a home of their own, how Gertrude built that home from the ground up, and why the Whitney's mission still sounds like a present tense. First, the person behind the name. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney wasn't just an heiress. She was a working sculptor and an insistent patron. In 1914, she set up the Whitney Studio in Greenwich Village, giving exhibition space and oxygen to living American artists who couldn't get a hearing in the academies. The goal wasn't decoration. It was circulation works moving into public view while their makers were alive. By 1929, her holdings had grown past 500 works. She tried the obvious route: donate them with a mandate to the Met. The answer, no, didn't end the project. It defined it. If an existing palace wouldn't make room for living American art, she would build a house where that art was the rule, not the exception. So she founded a museum. The Whitney Museum of American Art was established in 1930 and opened in 1931 on West 8th Street. On day one, its core was roughly 600 works from Gertrude's collection, enough to state a point without saying a word. The point was simple: the art of this country now. From the start, the Whitney wasn't just a repository, it was a program. It focused on living American artists, buying work in the year it was made, exhibiting it before consensus could sand the edges off. In 1932, the museum launched a recurring survey of the newest work, the show that would become the Whitney Biennial. The first director, Juliana Force, ran it with the urgency of someone building a bridge while people were already crossing. Why did Gertrude have to found the Whitney? Because American artists were undervalued by the institutions built for other traditions, and because waiting for acceptance would have meant losing a generation. The refusal from the Met wasn't a snub to sulk over. It was evidence that a distinct institution was necessary, one with a sharpened mandate and a door that swung open toward the studio, not the salon. Let's clear 2 myths. Myth 1: the Whitney began as a Vanderbilt vanity. The record shows the opposite: a sculptor-patron building platforms, Whitney Studio in 1914, then a museum in 1930, so that living American artists could be seen and sustained. Myth 2: the Whitney was anti-European. It wasn't a protest. It was a focus. The museum's charge was to develop American art on its own terms, which also meant placing it in conversation with the world, just not overshadowed by it. What did this change? It changed timing. Support arrived while artists were alive. It changed geography. Greenwich Village, not just Fifth Avenue, became a center of gravity. It changed grammar. A museum could be written in the present tense and still hold history. Listen to the cadence of those early years: a studio in 1914, a declined gift in 1929, a museum founded in 1930, doors opening in 1931, a biennial by 1932. That's not drift, that's design. 3 takeaways clean. 1, occupy the gap. When a legacy institution won't hold the work, found the space that will. 2, support the living. Buy in the year of making. Show before consensus. That policy isn't fashion, it's infrastructure. 3, make it recurring. A museum becomes a verb. When its surveys repeat, the biennial is a beat, not a one-off. If you stood on West 8th Street in 1931, you would have seen a modest doorway and a very large idea. American art deserves its own institution, and it will have one. In our next episode, we'll walk that idea forward from the village to the Breuer years and to the Whitneys' move downtown, how architecture kept rewriting the museum's voice without losing its mandate. Imagine walking into the icon room at Hillwood. Gold shimmers in the light enamel seems to breathe. On their pedestals, 2 imperial Fabergé eggs gleam like punctuation marks in a long story about time, power, and will. How did these treasures, once the pride of the Russian court, end up in a Washington mansion? And how did one woman born into American industry transform herself into the guardian of an exiled empire's art? Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post. To many, she was simply the serial heiress daughter of C.W. Post, who built Postum into the foundation of General Foods. She was born in 1887, raised in wealth and destined to be one of the richest women of her time. But Marjorie's legacy is not only measured in dollars or company shares. Her true argument was visual. She chose to let her life be written in porcelain gold and enamel in rooms filled with objects that told the story of vanished courts and displaced empires. The turning point came in the late 1932. Her third husband, Joseph E. Davis, was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. That meant Marjorie was living in Moscow during one of history's strangest transactions. The Soviet government, desperate for foreign currency, began selling off the treasures of the Romanovs. Palaces were emptied. Icons, silver, enamels, jewelry, all stripped from churches, aristocratic mansions and imperial storehouses were quietly placed on the market. For most foreigners, these objects were curiosities. For Marjorie, they were destiny. She had already trained her eye on French decorative arts, collecting Sèvres porcelain and 18th-century treasures. When she saw the Russian objects, she recognized their quality instantly. This was not random shopping, it was a strategy. She had access through her diplomatic position. She had timing buying at the very moment masterpieces were set in motion, and she had taste. The ability to see how Russian craftsmanship echoed and rivaled the French. Piece by piece, she brought them home. Among them were 2 Fabergé imperial Easter eggs, the 12 monograms egg of 1896, made for Empress Maria Feodorovna, and the Catherine the Great egg of 1914, celebrating Russia's most powerful empress. These were not trinkets. They were relics of sovereignty, symbols of faith and power, forced into exile. And now they lived in Marjorie's hands. But the collection did not stop at jewelry. It grew into nearly 90 Fabergé works alongside icons, silver services, court gifts, and hundreds of objects that once defined the language of Imperial Russia. She was not the only collector, but she was the one who would make a museum of it. In 1955, she purchased Hillwood Estate in Washington, D.C. To the outside eye, it was just another grand mansion. To Marjorie, it was a stage. She curated it as both her residence and her blueprint for a future museum. Every room had a role. The French porcelain room demonstrated her training in proportion and finish. The icon room rephrased that training in Russian gold enamel liturgical splendor, all set as if the Orthodox court had been reassembled in Washington. Hillwood was not decoration. It was an argument. Marjorie knew her role was temporary. She believed herself a custodian, not an owner. Her plan was to give Hillwood to the Smithsonian to ensure it would live on as a museum. When that arrangement failed, her foundation stepped in. In 1977, 2 decades after she purchased the estate, Hillwood opened to the public. A private home became a civic institution. Her vision became real. So what do these objects mean beyond their beauty? They tell us about the mechanics of power, a government selling its past, dealers translating value across borders, collectors anchoring displaced culture in new settings. It is soft power in reverse. not a nation sending art abroad, but a citizen creating a stage so exiled culture could still be seen. The lesson is clear. Timing is leverage. When history releases its treasures, someone must preserve them before they vanish. A house can be a museum. When designed with intention, rooms can argue, not just decorate, and most importantly, collections reach maturity only when the front door opens. A treasure hoarded is a story silenced. A treasure shared becomes a story retold. Stand again in the icon room. Look at the Fabergé eggs glowing under glass. They are not just art objects. They are markers of diplomacy, commerce, and taste. They chart a journey from the palaces of St. Petersburg through the storerooms of the Soviet state, across the Atlantic, and into a Washington mansion where the public can still see them today. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not simply buy, she built. She built a house, a museum, and above all, a promise that the treasures of an empire would not disappear into private vaults. That beauty, even when torn from its homeland, could still speak. And that one woman's vision could turn exile into permanence. Pause, soft close. In the shimmer of enamel and gold, in the silence of Hillwood's rooms, her promise still stands.